got Paul Jenkins from North Cybersecurity, who's going to talk to us about what is cybersecurity, and some of the different aspects that you have to address when you're in this industry. Are you there, Paul?
Yes, I'm here. You can hear me all right?
I can, thank you, and sorry.
So my name is Paul Jenkins. I'm a pen tester and ethical hacker. I'm going to give you a quick overview of my background, an introduction to the industry, and for anyone wishing to to get into ethical hacking, but mainly discuss how not so ethical hackers can break into websites and applications and the skills they use. What is cybersecurity? For me, it's for testing other people's cybersecurity posture. This might be a web application, it might be infrastructure, it may be networking. What we do is we effectively test all of their web applications to make sure there's no SQL injections in there, to make sure that their firewalls are set up correctly. And in general, just make sure that if they think they're secure, we put that to the test and we prove that is that the case or not the case. I'll run through what I do day to day as a pen tester, and if anyone is interested in the industry, feel free to drop me any questions in the Q&A on this, or I'll leave my details at the bottom, or I'll let you know at the end. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop me an email or find me on LinkedIn. I'll show you some of the techniques I use, but I do stress all of these techniques I'll show you during this talk. Just use them for educational purposes and research purposes only. Please don't hack anyone. Personally, I've always been interested in sort of cybersecurity from a young age. I authored my first security advisory whilst at school, but back then the cybersecurity industry was very different to what it is now. Websites in the late 90s, early millennium were mainly brochure websites. Websites got hacked. No one really cared, and therefore there was no money to protect them. Now the internet has grown substantially and people are coming into contact with it constantly in daily life for communication, for commerce, for government, for business. And with the increase in use and the scope of that use, the risk increases significantly. This, coupled with regulatory compliance requirements, means the need for a cybersecurity workforce is in high demand. Prior to pen testing, I spent 6 to 7 years in web development, DevOps, and networking. And I speak to a lot of people who are interested in becoming ethical hackers. And it's really popular at the moment. Some wanting to change jobs from a non-technical and non-IT related roles. And if I can give anyone any advice, for anyone looking to be a pen tester, is to try and spend at least a few years in industry, getting used to the ins and outs of the subject matter, which will be pen testing, whether that be business networks and infrastructure, whether we're talking about websites and web applications, or any up and coming technologies such as the Internet of Things or even self-driving cars. So for sort of any budding infrastructure pen testers, you want to be grounded in the technologies that make up business networks. You should know Windows domains are set up and managed, how networks, Wi-Fi, firewalls are configured, how to talk to Cisco equipment and other network devices, and have a good understanding of Windows and a bit of Unix. And the same goes for web applications. It's vital to get some real-world web development experience, and it's key to understand some of the common front-end and back-end development languages, such as PHP, ASP, JavaScript, Node.js. It's quite hard to pen test a JavaScript application, for example, if you don't understand the specific language. We've seen ex-employees hide backdoors in code. And if you don't fully understand that language, you might miss them if you're looking to be a pen tester in that area. If you are looking to go down that route and you are interested in web application pen testing, do reach out to Steve Blanks at the Institute of Coding at the University of Sunderland, who can get you started on that path to learning software applications to ultimately pen test them. And this is what my talk is sort of generally going to be about: how hackers breach websites, web application software, and we'll just briefly touch on some of the attack vectors that they will use, along with the skills and techniques that we will also use to identify the issues before the bad guys get in there. And what we'll do is just chat about some of the issues that has been affected. So each year, most of the common vulnerabilities are compiled into a top 10 list. In 2020, similar to previous years, the most common attack vector was called injection. And in essence, an injection attack stems from a code level vulnerability where the software fails to parse user's input correctly. The issue can be found in a search field or a login box. We've seen quite common issues with username or password input. Anywhere where you see a form on a website, or where the user is sending data to the website, that field, that data can be manipulated into talking to a database, or what we call cross-site scripting, where we're injecting JavaScript into the application. And the term injection covers a number of different types of attack, and we'll cover a few. But the first one we'll look at, where an attacker can talk directly to the database. And this is used to extract valuable data from email addresses to credit card numbers, edit passwords to gain privileges to applications, edit system privileges to gain access to functionality the attacker wouldn't otherwise have. And this attack is commonly known as a SQL or SQL injection. This attack method was used quite well a few years ago on the internet and mobile provider TalkTalk. I think it was 2015, where a TalkTalk employee spotted issues with the website and launched an investigation before TalkTalk issued a statement to its customers where they told them their personal data had been breached. The investigation resulted in jail time, I think, for two young lads, and TalkTalk said that the attack cost their business around £77 million in losses. The data breach was published and sold on the dark web. The information contained within, including things like personal details, bank details, all sorts of information tied to that account. Its executives were subject to ransom of the data. Its customers were subject to identity theft. And this is where fraudsters with access to people's personal data pretend to be the victim and attempt to access loans or credit cards, transferring money to themselves by many means and leaving the debt with the victim. Other attacks we've seen was individual phishing attacks, as we know, otherwise known as spear phishing. And these attacks were a lot more successful, as one phishing email can contain the last 4 digits of bank details, people's names. That way, the email seems a lot more real to probably what you're used to, where it's misspelled, grammar's terrible, and they just said hello customer rather than your specific name, compared to a legitimate email which has all that information in there. So I was going to sort of run through how that hack happened, but we're not necessarily technical to the actual vulnerable code or the TalkTalk hack or any of the attacks we'll briefly chat about. We'll gain a bit more understanding of how those happened. So for most SQL injection attacks, you'll start with a form Now, we often see it on search forms or login forms as a pen tester. And it's usually, for example, the language might be PHP, it might be on a MySQL server, but it can be done across different languages, databases and frameworks. And more advanced versions of this attack can be used where frameworks do have preventative measures, but there's different ways you would attack the website. So once you've got access to a website with a vulnerable form, you may or may not have the code for that. There's a lot of open source applications where you can see the code, so you can then decide, well, actually, this area code doesn't have any preventative measures, so that's something that we want to try and attack. Otherwise, we would just try and identify if there's an issue. So in the code itself, they would have a database query, and the variable from the field, such as a search field, would be passed directly to that database query. What the developer should do is put in some code to check that it's not going to cause a problem with that database query. In many database languages, you might encapsulate a variable by a single or double quoted. Then, so you have a start single quote, the word finished by an ending single quote. So if your data that you're passing to that database query contains another single quote, then that will effectively just break the that database call, and the output of that would be a database error. So when we're pen testing web applications, we'll start with, let's see if we can put a single quote, a double quote in there. And if the database does error, then we can say, actually, there's probably something wrong with that, and we'll look a bit further into the application. The next step would be then to try and talk to the database. So using PHP, MySQL, what you might want to try and do to bypass a login page, which is a common attack, is you'd enter your username as you would normally, but when you enter your password, you'd add single quote character space or 1 = 1. And in effect, that would always be true. So what you're saying to the database is the password being the wrong password because you don't know the password, or 1 = 1. And that would be always true. So it would then bypass your authentication of the system, and then you'd gain access to the application. Once you're in there, there may be other areas to look at. If you're looking to extract data from that, you may use some more advanced queries, which I've not got with me, just through the webcam. But in effect, you can take information from that database. Once you can start talking to that database, you can put in anything you want, and if that information is contained within that, your sort of access rights are correct, which you tend to be. If you're in a web application, then it will give you that data. Other common errors that we see in web applications is a lot of cross-site scripting. This tends to work well when you've got such as a profile page or a directory listing website, where you can inject some JavaScript into your profile, and that will then display within the website. But again, as the developer hasn't put any code in there to remove any dodgy characters, you can start entering HTML as you would. So when we start pen test with this, we'll usually start with a H1 tag and see if we can see any differences in the way the application responds to that data. So is it just pushing out H1 tags? Is it pushing out actual HTML? So anything after the Anything after that field is all in H1, which is the header tag in HTML. That way we can determine what other things we can pass through to that field. Usually we would add JavaScript in there, and from that we can do all sorts. So to test it, we put an alert box in there to see if that alert box would render correctly. If it does, we then move on to things like hijacking any cookies. A lot of the cookies, when you're logged into a profile website or a directory type website, you'd have a login account. And once you're in there, to validate you as a user of that website, you will be assigned a cookie, and in that cookie there'll be a long string of so many characters and numbers, which will be unique to you. And that way the website can say, well, actually you are the logged in user. But if you've got access to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and you've added that into the system and that person views that page, you can then extract that cookie and send it to your own website. Then if you replicate that and log into the website, you won't necessarily need to log in through using password, because the website would already believe that you are that user and that you already have a valid session. So cross-site scripting is one of the biggest issues that we find. Third biggest issue as part of a web application pen test is we find a lot of issues around local file inclusion. A lot of applications, when they're being built, they'll be built with lots of different files. So the way they generate templates and websites, they will pass the information and they will apply that to a template file. If we can identify how that mechanism works, we can often tweak the way the templates are generated, the templates are accessed, and then point the URL to an external web page, which then would be passed within the system to be a template. Then that would run any commands that we have in there. So if, for example, if it was PHP again, and we've got a PHP text file, and that system uses that as their template of their website, we can hide commands in there. And in effect, if they've not checked where that template is or how that template is loaded, we can replicate that, add commands in there, and start taking control of the server. So them are the three biggest areas for us in web application pen testing, but you've also got things like infrastructure pen testing. Infrastructure pen testing tends to be around networks and Windows domain setups and the standard business network. Vulnerability assessment in the last talk is a big part of that, but you're also looking at Wi-Fi assessments. I was going to show you how to do the Wi-Fi hacks, and it can be quite simple. So anyone who's running a WEP or a WPA personal connection can be breached quite quickly. But WPA2 enterprise is quite secure. So we often find a lot of people running old technologies. So if any businesses are out there thinking about their security posture to do with Wi-Fi, and they're running old kit, it may be worth an upgrade or taking a look at what you're doing there. I know this is geared up for students mainly, so if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I'm more than happy to answer them.
That was great, Paul. Thank you very much, and some really useful insight into some of the work that you've done.